If you're familiar with any kind of racing engines at all, you probably heard of an SB2. Especially if you're into NASCAR, you might be wondering, obviously it's called stock car racing and the cars are not stock. The engines are just as not stock, but at one time they were. And you probably wondered, how did it get from being a stock car, stock type engine to these all-out clean sheet race engines we have today? You're gonna get to see all the details up close with the real parts from a guy who has lived the entire era from the stock block, stock head era all the way up until the modern R07. And just to get you familiarized before we get into this, Generation 1 is the stock block iron head. Generation 2, we'll call that aluminum heads, like the Pontiac castings that you've heard about maybe. With that Generation 2, we'll also include the 18-degree as cast heads, since the Pontiac heads were basically turned into that. And then we'll call Generation 3 the SB2. That's where the biggest difference comes. And then you have the R07, which is the evolution of the SB2, and that is the current engine. It's also worth noting that from this entire era, all of the General Motors teams were using the corporate small block Chevy engine. We're here with Keith Dorton at Automotive Specialist Racing Engines. I couldn't think of anybody more qualified to tell us, why would you be so qualified to do this? Why did I call you?
Well, I guess because we've been doing it all our life. Started the business in 1965. Of course, there were big blocks back then. But as we progressed, and they changed the rules to small block, we had to use basically a stock block, like a truck block. We would put better main cap on it, mostly General Motors parts. We actually used a stock General Motors crankshaft to start with. But the engines were making less than 600 horsepower at that time. Because these early blocks were bad to crack down in the webbing and so forth. This helped tie all that together. Early billet caps that were made. See,
Big difference.
Yeah, it's a big difference. It's, instead of a cast iron, it's a billet for one thing, and it ties into the block, which it actually strengthens the block as well as the cap itself.
But the factory 4-bolt caps were not splayed like that, were they?
No, they weren't. They were straight down.
So you had to drill your own holes for that too?
Yep.
So if you started with a factory 4-bolt block, did the splayed thread holes interfere with the thread holes that were already in there?
No, it didn't. It didn't. It was outboard. Actually, as you can see, it tied right into the meaty part of the block, right under the handrails.
Did anybody try to experiment with taking a factory 2-bolt block and doing that, like theorizing that it would have more meat in here from not having that thread cut in it?
They did, yeah.
Did that work?
It did. Junior Johnson was the first one that I know of that did this. He wanted to run a larger cylinder bore and a shorter stroke. I'm not sure exactly what his reasoning was, but today, and even prior to today, we found that a larger cylinder bore would let the head breathe better. It wasn't as restrictive on the shrouding the valves and so forth. Shorter stroke, that changed the compression height for the pistons, a whole different deal. The way to do that then, the only block you could get was a 400 cubic inch small block. They were all 2-bolt mains. So what we did for Junior then, billet caps made for the 350 main size. And we made a spacer to go in the block, 400 main, which was a little over 200 thousandths bigger. That put the spacer in the block, put the cap on it that was the correct size for a 350 crank, and line board it. Like I say, the 400s were 2-bolt, so we put the splayed caps on them like that. That worked awful good. That quickly, when they came out with the bow tie block later on, that quickly evolved. That's what everybody did. Used a bigger bore, shorter stroke.
Is that the same era Junior was running the 180-degree headers and stuff on his cars?
Yeah.
You were building his engines back then?
We didn't build his engines. We did his block work and cylinder head work.
Were the cylinder heads you were using like a factory, like a Corvette head, or do you remember what it was from?
The very first ones were factory type head. That quickly evolved into what they referred to as the bow tie cast iron head. Required an extensive amount of work. So it was all done by hand. The heads were very fragile. It was a given they were going to crack in a 500-mile race. We actually found some ceramic sealer that we seal these heads with before we put them on the engine. And then race day, the last things the guys had done before the race started, they'd pour another bottle of this ceramic sealer and let it circulate, because more times than not, the head would crack during the race. And this sealer would let them finish the race. Sometimes they could be repaired, sometimes not. I don't remember how many years we had to run those things, but I remember we ate a lot of cast iron dust.
I bet you were relieved when that changed.
Oh yeah. This is a Pontiac. When Pontiac was still involved in racing, they're the ones that actually went with, what Chevrolet did too. They had a bow tie aluminum head, but everybody ended up running the Pontiac head that was made by Brodix for Pontiac. And much more reliable head, a lot easier to work with, and the performance was better too. But the longevity was outstanding compared to the old cast iron.
Just tell how much heavier.
Oh yeah,
that is.
it's heavy too, but you can see the difference in the intake runners. The intake runners raised up, which gives it a straighter shot to the valve and the combustion chamber.
Now, what would the power difference from this era to this era be?
When we first started with these things, and these things evolved over a number of years by changing the valve angle, by milling the deck on an angle, which in turn changed the valve angle, which in turn gave it a straighter shot to the cylinder and the valve. Before any of those modifications, it was probably in the 30 horsepower range, but it evolved into probably 100. The next step, and I don't have one of those to show you, was the 18 degree head that Chevrolet came out with. And the biggest difference in it was in the valve angle and a little different intake runner. Just looking at them side by side, you're not going to be able to tell the difference.
Once you took one of these and welded it up and milled it to be 18 degrees or something, and it was essentially like they were making what you guys were doing to this
That happened
already.
That happened, yes. Yeah. So that's when you started getting in the 100 horsepower gain over the original cast iron heads. The next thing that I can show you is the SB2. You get more of a direct shot. Intake runners raised up. You see how much compared from here to the bottom, from here, gives you a straighter shot to the valves, a bigger runner. Staggered valves gives it more airflow on both the intake and exhaust.
Wasn't it 1998 that the first time the SB2 was run?
I think so. Right, real close there, 97, 98. It was basically a whole different engine. You know, the blocks were different. Same block height, but the lifters were staggered.
Something that is not apparent by looking at this stuff on a bench is that the traditional small block Chevy, the intake manifold has water passage in it. That's where the thermostat is, and the distributor goes through it also. The SB2 got rid of both of those things. The SB2 had a separate valley plate that had the water passage in it with the distributor hole, and the intake manifold was totally separate from those things. So you could take the intake manifold off without having to screw with your timing or have coolant everywhere. Much better design for working on a race car.
But that was the really major change. That's when the engines went from 700 or under to 800. Quite a bit of difference and all around on this head. It's just, you can see, even on the exhaust side, the difference of how the runners are taller.
Yeah, just looking at it at an angle,
Right.
How much of the valve, if there was a valve there, how much of the hole you can see out
Right.
here versus there. It's like looking, you can see straight through it,
Right.
but not here.
Yeah.
I think I did see on here, because this is the Hendrick head, that it had this port on the water jacket inside here. This thing here.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Is that to keep the head gasket happier between
Right.
these cylinders?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. This thing, these are Siamese, and the block is also between these cylinders, which is a good time to point out that from this to the R07, this went from a 4,400 bore spacing to a 4,500, which gave more room in between here, as well as getting rid of those 2 exhaust valves, so that helped a lot. But these are drilled in between, and then this is actually pulling water out here to keep it flowing between the 2 exhaust valves.
There's like the 184 bow tie block on the 18-degree heads. Is that the same block that the SB2 started on, or did they come with the roller? Like, when did the roller cam and the offset lifters and everything become the standard?
You could still bolt the SB2 head on a conventional, like a 184 bow tie block, but it takes a special cam. So it quickly evolved into the SB2 having its own block staggered lifters that more fits the cylinder head configuration.
Because you could take an SB2 head and bolt it onto a standard small block Chevy block if you wanted to use a special camshaft and lifters, that means you could take a NASCAR Cup Series head from early 2007 and bolt it onto the block from a Chevy K1500 pickup truck with a 350. That means the old small block Chevy architecture lasted longer in NASCAR than it did on the street, because by then the LS engine had already been around for almost 10 years. So, you know, maybe these engines were actually more stock car than you thought they were for longer than you did think they were. Or maybe you didn't. I don't know. Is this news to you? Like, speak up in the comments. Is that surprising?
Well, if you want to look at the bottom too, this is...
Is this like the evolved SB2 block? Because it's got the these on here. I've heard stories about these. Can you explain what this does?
Well, this brings the water. If you can see, the water normally comes into the front of the block on a small block Chevy. But here again, with the Siamese ports, hottest parts in the center, so bringing the water into the center of the block instead of the front.
Does that help with overheating?
It did.
Obvious visual differences going on here. This looks like a middle ground between a standard small block and an R07 block.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, you can see the staggered lifter bores.
And the original 184 bow tie blocks did not have this scavenge port built into them, did they?
They did.
They did?
The regular Chevrolet does not have that. In fact, we would drill, and tap this ourselves.
Did you have to rebuild those after every race? Fully? Or?
We did in that era. Daytona, when you're down there for 10 days or more, and all the practice qualifying in the 125s, it was pretty common practice back then. The best engine, you run the 125 to get qualified, and then pull it out, bring it up here, and turn it around for the 500. Yeah. The year we won the 500, 90, I guess it was, that engine ran the whole deal. But we were afraid to run 500 miles after running probably 200 or better. So they pulled it out, brought it up here that night. Jeff and I worked straight through, turned it around. They got back to them on Saturday, I guess.
That was Derek Cope in that year.
Yeah. What exactly would you have to do? Would you just refresh things, or did things break already?
We disassembled completely, magnafluxed everything, checked the valves, put new springs in it, fresh rings. Most of the time we didn't have to change the engine bearings, but mainly just inspect everything, look for heat in the pistons. The next step after the SB2 was the R07, which was again a clean sheet of paper. I'll show you the difference in the blocks as we go along here. No bad spot in it. Yeah.
It's just clean.
Okay.
Wow.
But as you can see from the head bolt pattern, and everything's different. Similar, but in some ways, but like looking at them from the intake side, port spacing and all is very similar between the R07 and the SB2. But there's a lot of difference. With the evolution of this thing, the drivers really liked them, because to start with, they didn't make quite as much horsepower on the top end, but they drove better. The torque curve was flatter, and it would accelerate better, especially on some of the short tracks. But as time went on in the development of this thing, you know, it was when we got over 900 horsepower.
Yeah, now that doesn't look anything like what comes in a production vehicle.
Yeah. And if you look at this block and you look at a Toyota or a Ford, they're very similar.
This is like the rocket ship of blocks to the SB2 over there.
So, what were the biggest reliability issues with the SB2 that the R07 fixed? Or was there really anything?
Not really.
Was there really even any need to do this? If, like, was it needed, or is it just done because it could be?
I mean, this is just me speaking, but no, I don't think it needed to be done. I mean, you know, we could make the horsepower and the reliability there, but the big gain here, if we had an SB2 with a 400 or 500 bore spacing, which we've had Dorton and some others do that for some of the other types of racing. You know, this, as you can tell, is specifically made for racing. A lot of development. For instance, the cooling system. You know, you've got this water jacket here and the way it flows, and you can see how high the water jacket is. See, there's no coolant down here in the bottom part of the cylinder. Then that's the weight.
Yeah, that's interesting that there's all the passages in here are kind of like externally visible, and there's not just like a wall.
Yeah, right. One big difference that you can see between, you know, the stock block and like this evolution of the small block is look at the size of the cam tunnel and the size of the main bearing.
It's like they changed diameters.
Right.
They switched each other.
Right. Yeah, this was, you know, back in that era, it was just opposite. You know, now we're running a 60 millimeter roller cam and a 2-inch main bearing. So now that wasn't possible back in the early days because of process and materials on the crankshafts. We went to, when we first started using roller bearings, roller cam bearings, we went to a 50 millimeter, which was a common bearing. It was not a bearing made specifically for automotive use. And we just took what was available and adapted it. The smaller cams, of course, they were cast iron before, and we had trouble with them breaking. And even with the steel cams, with the small diameter, at higher RPMs, we had trouble with them twisting. You know, the timing would vary from the front of the engine to the back of the engine. So that's the thing of the past now.
So that's interesting that in the early days, the crank journal had to be bigger to keep it alive, and now it's the cam.
Yeah.
It's like maybe someday material will evolve to the point where the cam can be smaller again. It won't twist itself.
Yeah, it's just 180 from what it used to be. 20 years ago, they said, you know, it's crazy. It wouldn't work. Well, it wouldn't work 20 years ago.
What were some of the shortcomings of the SB2 head that were revised for the R07 head? Because like the most obvious one is these center ports here.
Yeah.
Now they're not right next to each other anymore.
Yeah. That was always been a kind of a heating issue, you know, on the small block with the two exhaust ports being right together. So that did help that. But the tendency, the SB2, and we still use a lot of these, but primarily we use the SB2 for our land speed engines. Land speed racing, you know, racing on salt flats, you're running on a real narrow tire and a relatively slick surface, and you can't use a lot of low end power. The SB2 was more of a upper end power range. They didn't know when to quit, and they still don't, you know. I mean, if you got valve train that'll stand at 10,000 RPMs, you know, they're still making good horsepower.
Didn't the C3 come out and it was stomping the Brodix head, and then the SB2 came out to fight for it on the C3?
Pretty much, yeah. Because That we were doing a lot of the C3 Ford heads and engines at that time also. Yeah.
So you were building all the manufacturers for
Yeah.
NASCAR teams back then.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That could never happen now.
Yeah, no, we never got involved with Toyota.
If you guys were building everybody's engine, could you kind of help people out in a way? Kind of like, oh, this C3 is better, we could do this, this, and that to make like the Brodix head better?
You had to be very careful about how you approach that, in that since we were doing basically the three manufacturers, you know, I didn't want to, and I didn't have favorites. You didn't want to tell the Chevrolet guy that the Ford's got 30 more horsepower.
Yeah.
Or the Mopar guy, you know, whatever.
Yeah, I didn't know if they were aware of that, or if like any of that was ever discussed.
How'd you walk that line?
Yeah, that was a fine line you had to walk. Quite honestly, all of them had different characteristics in that time. You know, there's a lot of similarities now between the Toyota, the Chevrolet, and the Ford. I mean, you know, the regular mechanics might not even be able to tell the difference, you know. Just like the cars in that era, the engines were, anybody could walk up and see the difference between Ford, Chrysler, Chevrolet. The characteristics were different, but we had to be a little politically correct, I guess you'd say, since we were doing work for all of them. And then you had to contend with the drivers too. You know, Jack's got more horsepower than I got. He can accelerate better, or on and on and on. You know, he's beat me down the straightaway. That happens even today with the same brand. And we had it back in that era where two Chevrolets running together, and one of them's running better than the other. And in reality, they could have swapped engines and it'd still been the same way. Maybe it's something to do with the car, maybe it's something to do with the driver. I guess the biggest single improvement in the evolution was between here and the SB2. You know, it was more gradual from then, and now the increases in power from very small increments.
A lot of people would know your brother as the Hendrick engine guy.
Yes, sir.
And you were doing your own thing over here. At what point did you go different directions? And did you ever talk to each other about this stuff when you were not on the same roof anymore?
He, of course, he started with me when he was, you know, just able to sweep the floor, just young enough, and he was 10 years younger than I am. He picked up really quick and worked for me for years, and we did a lot. That was in that era where we were doing a lot of those things, a lot of the NASCAR stuff. In fact, he had a hand in quite a bit of it. As time went on, when he got out of school, he wanted to see the world, so he went drag racing. And worked with Stockton Martin, who we did a lot of work for them, and some of the other guys. And he got to travel. And then when he kind of got to settle down, you know, Harry Hyde offered him a job, which, you know, I'm proud to be a part of what he did, and I'm even more proud of what he did on his own, starting and then evolving into working with Rick. So he had a hand in the development of the SB2. As far as sharing information after he went to work for Rick and we were doing our own thing, when we would have socially with the family, we didn't talk about this. I didn't want to infringe on him, he didn't want to infringe on me.
A common question, because we did a video similar to this about the Ford evolution, and people are like, well, what was the specific horsepower of the C3 versus the D3 and the FR9? Like, there's not really a clear answer to that, because everybody's was different, and you had incremental gains in each one over time. It was like, it was just a platform change. It wasn't like a power light switch changed.
Right, that's exactly right. You know, the only way to do that is with power adders, nitrous, boost. One thing we haven't talked about that kind of relates to camshaft, cylinder head, and so forth, valve train stability. You know, we ran stud-mounted rocker arms, individual rock arms, for a number of years. Had to put stud girdles and everything else to hold it together. But we were limited to really under 8,000 RPMs to be durable. Shaft rock arms evolved from there. Better valve springs, lighter valves. You know, we're running a 6mm stem valve now, titanium. Nobody would ever really thought that 20 years ago that you could do that. When we were running a 11/32 stem and was scared to go any smaller. And also valve springs, we were running a lot of spring tension to get 8,000 RPMs. Now we're running a spring that's half the size and quite a bit less tension than running upwards towards 10,000 RPMs. A lighter spring is going to help just like a lighter valve.
Was there a particular era of engine building and development that you consider to be like the most fun or entertaining, or just like I don't know, maybe like whenever the beginning of all this technology started happening? Because like you said, it's not anywhere near the same as it used to be. Where's the line of fun between throwing stuff against the wall, having no idea what's going to happen, versus having some technology to learn about it, or too much of it to make it not as fun?
Well, it's still fun, but the big difference now is it was gratifying, I guess you might say, to take something that was meant to make 300 horsepower and you're making 700. That was fun. And it's, I feel blessed that it's an occupation that I've been in all my life, that it's a rare time when I don't look forward to coming to work in the morning and hate to leave. You get involved in a project, no matter what it is, whether it's camshafts or cylinder heads, and before you know it, you've got 14 hours straight working it. And I've never been in it for the money, so to speak. I know I'm just intrigued by the way an internal combustion engine works, and I can't believe we pick up new things as regular as we still do. Why didn't I think of that? And gosh, I didn't realize it worked that way. It still happens.
That's really cool.
That is interesting. So you don't really think that you have a particular pinpoint of a high watermark of gratification when it comes to doing that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's you want to see the good results of your toil and labor, but it ain't always been about winning. I mean, if the engine runs good, we done our job.
We tried to get Keith to tell some secrets or stories about cheating or anything like that, and he wouldn't dive into it. Maybe he never did, I don't know, but we tried. It didn't work. Before you ask, if you're new to the channel and you watch this whole thing, you can find the video about the Ford engine evolution on the Racing History Nerd Zone playlist. We have all kinds of videos about engine tech, old race cars, race shops, race tracks, anything that is basically interesting to somebody who likes racing and race cars. Like we're kind of like the same stuff. We make videos about things that you like. If you watched this entire video and thought it was great, you're in the right place. And if you're like us and you care about this history and you want it to be known and documented, you can help the channel grow by costing absolutely nothing, just by hitting the thumbs up, leaving a comment, and sending it to a friend that you think would like this stuff too. There are only so many people that use YouTube that watch these kinds of videos. So if we want to grow, we have to get more people to use YouTube, basically. Or more people who are using YouTube to be aware that this type of material exists and that they would actually find it interesting. Instead of just, doing burnouts and blowing stuff up. We still need to do a video on the Dodge small block evolution, which is coming. We're working on finding somebody to do that. This is my personal R5 P7 that will be going to my Grand National Super Series race car. Check out the Stapleton 42 Extra channel to find the videos of us wrapping the car. There'll be more stories on there, kind of behind the scenes things that we won't post on the main channel. things you can get to know us better and interact with us more over there. But like always, I'm just glad we're able to do what we get to do. I'm glad there's enough people interested in it that we can make videos about it and somehow sustain ourselves, even though it is very hard work. If you weren't watching this, we wouldn't be able to do them at all. It'd be probably fabricating turbo kits in Oklahoma or Texas or something right now and not be doing this. Don't forget to speak up, leave a comment. Tell us where you came from, tell us how you found us, tell us what you want to see. We want to interact with you, we want to get to know you. We like to become familiar with you guys who watch videos regularly. We actually do remember you if you speak up enough, so let it rip.
Unrelated, but how was working at Holman Moody? Was it fun? How was it?
Well, I was pretty young then. So I was pretty intimidated when I went to work, and I was carrying a little Craftsman tackle box with all my tools in it, and going against working with these other guys. But it was a great learning experience. It got me really started in a higher level of engines. It was great being able to know that you had a part or did engines for some of my heroes, you know, Curtis Turner, Fireball Roberts, and all of them. And then evolved in when we started our own business, being able to work with the Earnhardts and Junior Johnson, Bud Moore, you know, a lot of those guys.